very much, John, and thanks for the turnout, you guys. I'm going to show you a deck here in a minute, but I'd first like to say hello to John and Anne. John, there's no need to acknowledge, just sit back and relax. You're amongst a lot of friends who respect what you've done, respect you, very supportive, very interested in your impressive achievements. And John, this is a tribute to you. So what I'm going to do is come up here with a PowerPoint presentation. Let me just see if I get this. Tell me if this comes up. He said, oh yeah, I have to say share, right? Share.
Looks like it's coming, Dave. All right. I'm going to go on mute now. Yeah, we got it. I'm going to go on mute now. Well done.
Okay. I'm going to talk to the deck, and it's a deck that is based on a number of things. One is my nomination letter for John's induction to the Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame. Confirm you can hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay.
Yes.
John has written a 13-chapter manuscript, very detailed, penned essentially for his kids and his grandkids. And then there's enough material there for a possible book, and that's being tracked down by Anne, and I'm helping where I can. And of course, by personal experience, some 50 years of personal experience. And I've also added, for your information, because you're probably not used to such things as ejections out of a fighter about to hit the earth, but Three years, I've Mark Arnault kindly agreed to be my seconder, particularly in his role as Minister of Transport Canada. And of course, John Laidler provided one of 6 letters of corroboration for the whole package. Now, I'm going to focus on John's accomplishments, quite frankly, remarkable accomplishments in the largely esoteric world of experimental test flying. But I'm going to touch a little bit on John's very hairy, high-speed, ultra-low-altitude ejection as a CF-104 student in Cold Lake in 1971. I'm not going to go into any kind of chronology with various and sundry. I'm going to focus on his accomplishments. And let me say that I had the pleasure of meeting John in 1968. His gunshot wounds had already healed, and he was fine. And in 1969, he was CSL 5 Squadron. I was his D CSL. John, as we know him, you know, he's laid back. He's unflappable. I have never seen him angry. And I've also never saw much of him at the college either, except Thursday nights and fire drill and roll call weekly. And the 3 weeks before his 4th year finals, because he was at Anne's all the time, you see, in Kingston Town. He relentlessly still tells little Johnny jokes, and he always gets the most out of them. He's competitive. For some reason, he thinks Montreal is better than Toronto. His TR6 was the best in his mind, but my MGB had 3 windshield wipers. We also always competed for the thickest steaks. But I often picture John sitting in a lumberjack shirt in front of a bonfire, drinking Gros 50, or in a flying suit, sipping the fighter pilot scotch with an old port cigarillo at the back bar in Baden or Cold Lake. But behind his great understated disguise, as Anne would say, is brilliance, confidence, competence, persuasiveness, athletic strength, and he's a serial top achiever. So I'm going to take about 35 to 40 minutes. I'm going to talk to the slides, and I ask you to hold off on questions until afterwards, and I'll just walk you through. Now there's John in his happy place, smiling, looking at the 104. That's him in the 104 taking off out of Cold Lake. That thing is a Ferrari of single-seat fighters. Even Ernest Hemingway talked about the first great airplane, and I have no idea why Ernest Hemingway would be interested in fighter planes, but he would say the first airplane you love, you'll love it forever, and that's the 104 for John. It's a Mach 2 Ferrari. I will then, let's just move on here. Whoops. Okay, I'm not going to do a chronology on his awards, but there's the list. the first 6 are academic in nature. I'm assuming you can see these. And then the Lethan Tittle Award at the Edwards Test Pilot School for outstanding graduate, and in fact, for the first non-American to top that course. And then thereon are operationally related nationally and international awards and acknowledgements of what John has contributed to aviation around the world and in Canada. Quick tour d'horizon. We got our pilot's wings in Gimli. We both moved to aerospace engineering test establishment. We both had a couple of projects. He was seeding clouds, cumulonimbus clouds out of a modified T-33 with silver oxide, silver iodide, I'm sorry, to make sure that the farmers in the Hailstone Alley in southern Alberta would not get damaged too much. He went to 434 to learn how to fly fighters, and then to 417, the operational training unit. And then there's a big oops here, which I'm going to comment on shortly. Ended up in Europe on 441 TAC Fighter Squadron, and then he got his dream job, or rather his dream posting, first of all, to Edwards Test Pilot School, and then on a test squadron there, came back to Canada as head of aircraft flight test, all fleets, and then worked for the rest of his flying career at NRC, the Flight Research Laboratory. Let me turn to his rather hairy ejection. He's got one less landing than takeoffs and a destroyed 769 CF-104 in his wake. He was a student leading a 4-ship conventional attack readiness during a time that the Canadian forces was just coming out of the nuclear role and going into conventional, and they were sort of doing some things, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But this is the kind, these 4 bullets are the kinds of things that everybody had to subscribe to, and that's a plus or minus 3 seconds of time of day, time on target. I mean, it was critical for deconfliction with NATO forces trying to hit the Warsaw Pact second echelon or other targets in across the inter-German border or Czechoslovakia at the time. Ultra high speed, ultra low level, under surface to air missile and anti-aircraft radars. Basically a quick pop-up to acquire the target, get back down on this one for a 200-foot level attack at 540 knots, which in street words are 620 miles per hour, 900 feet a second. That's the profile. I won't go into that. He's on the right, 035, pop up and get back down. But typically in that part of the world, in the forests north of Cold Lake, target acquisition was difficult for anybody, whether you're an experienced fighter pilot or a student fighter pilot. He took some time, he had to take some time to find the target. He found it, and by the time he found it, he was inside the roll-in altitude to get down to 200 feet. He barely missed the ground, and he shortened a 60-foot tree by 10 feet. He ejected at 620 miles per hour, and he sustained a traumatic brain injury. And it is linked to Parkinson's disease, and Dr. Chris Skinner, of course, our classmate, knows this. This is the biodynamic response to severe wind blast. It is taken from a 1949 video of a colonel, Air Force colonel, sitting on a Holloman Air Force Base rocket sled accelerating from stop to high speed. I don't know what the high speed is, but I think that the one on the right looks a lot like John Croll, because that's where he instantly entered the wind blast at almost supersonic speeds. He lost his helmet immediately. His oxygen mask ripped off his face and caused a scar on his forehead. His head slammed into the seat headrest, and he sustained a serious head injury. And the pilot member of the board barely recognized him. They weren't sure that was John. So he really took it. This is from the 238-page board of inquiry, 44 inches, that's 8.5 by 11. Left, you can't read that, but it's basically, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but he
yeah, we can see it
back here. Impact of the aircraft was here, and thousands of pieces all the way down 1,900 feet. Engines always go the farthest in a crash. So in John's ubiquitous logic, I saw the tree, I hit the tree, I heard a big bang, I started to lose vision, I ejected, I lost consciousness, from chapter 8 of A Brief Visit to Heaven. And this to say, you can read it yourself, but 25 years, I guess, is approximately the time from head injury to the onset of serious effects from that head injury, Parkinson's disease in particular. Here's the profile. Now there's the target. And if he were to actually hit that target, you could look at 1.5 to 2 feet off the left of your screen where he would release the bomb to hit that target. That line in the middle is the 200-foot level, and you can see he's already overflown it. He's trying at this stage not to hit the ground. He nails the tree here. He gets kicker, and now he's basically trying to not hit the ground. And that's 1,000 feet past the target. He gets kicker, and I'll talk to you about that in just a second, but he's trying to pull the nose up. The kicker is warning him that his angle of attack is getting too high, and it's trying to push his nose down with a 50-foot force, 50-pound force to overcome on the control column. Believe me, in a situation like this, you can pull 300 pounds, I'm sure of it. 1 second from here to here. Now, first of all, the pop to a level attack was removed from the syllabus. By the way, John later was flying on John's wing when he saw this. He saw the explosion, he saw the parachute, and he circled for a bit to make sure John was okay. So that was removed from the syllabus. It's a bit tough for an experienced fighter pilot, never mind a student. He was presented with the treetop and the seat D-ring at his grad dinner. And in fact, before I show that, I just want to show you some of this aerodynamics. This is relative airflow. The picture on the left is straight and level, zero, let's call it 0 degrees angle of attack. If you get slow like you do on landing, angle of attack increases. But if it gets too high, there's a shaker and then a kicker warning the pilot to back off, because if you don't, the wing flow, pardon me, the airflow from the wing blocks the tail, and you end up with a violent pitch up, out of control and loss of control. If that happens, you need about 10 to 20,000 feet below you to recover. He had less than 60 feet. So he was basically a hair's breadth between losing control and impacting the ground at a very high speed. That's his D-ring. I don't know how he did it. Fastest hand in the West, but he pulled it. And I would suggest to you that from slicing off the treetop to pulling the handle happened faster than you can say this. So it was very, very fast. I'm going to go through the ejection sequence very quickly. This is the C2 ejection seat, a very good one in the 104. I'll point out 3 things. This is the D-ring. It is between the pilot's legs. You pull that back, you make sure your spine is straight and your head is back, and you're wearing spurs, which are connected by cables in the bottom here. The second thing is the arm protector, arm guard that flips forward at a certain point with a netting that prevents your arms from flailing. And the third point is this is the butt snapper. What it is a piece of canvas anchored here at the front of the seat. And at a certain point, when the seatbelt releases, this thing reels up really quickly and forms a triangle between the seat back, the seat bottom, and the strap itself that punts him out of the seat. So he pulls the D-ring. The arm guards rotate to prevent arm flailing. The foot reels retract the spurs to prevent leg flailing. The canopy is ejected. All of that happens almost simultaneously. An explosive charge propels the pilot and the seat up the rails with a force of 12 to 15 G for about a half a second. That's tolerable by a human being. John is knocked unconscious in the wind blast. As soon as his head rises above the canopy bow, he gets whacked. At the same time, the rocket sustainer fires to clear him from the tail. His spurs and D-ring cables are cut because he needs to be separated from the seat. Believe me, when you're pulling on a handle like this, you're hanging onto it. But if it's still attached to the seat, you're in trouble. So that's why the cables are cut. The seat buckle unlocks, opens, and arms the parachute. The butt kicker fires, kicking him out of the seat. And the pilot chute pulls out the main parachute, and the parachute canopy fully blossoms. That happens between 4 and 5 seconds, the whole sequence, all automatic. And he's unconscious throughout this whole thing with a TBI, at least the onset. Now, he caught the bullet at CMR, but thank God he dodged this one. So here he is, back on track here. Officer Croll, 441 TAC Fighter Squadron, proper upgrades, became a Top Gun weapons instructor. And then he finds out he's going to the United States Air Force test pilot school. Here's the class. John is up here, fourth from the left on the back. Another Canadian, but he's a test engineer, flight test engineer. John is the candidate for the test pilot. A bunch of guys from various places. And you can see 10 years here. It's all United States Air Force, over the Marines, over other countries, over everybody else. Canada nails it. And this piece here, first, he graduates, and then he's posted as a Canadian Armed Forces exchange officer and qualified experimental test pilot to 6512 Test Squadron, Edwards Air Force Base, California. He, for the first year of 3, flew many chase missions and for various things. And I'll show you something in a second, but quality evaluation of flights, they always keep their hands in anything to validate the airplane's flying characteristics. And he was doing a lot of that as well. That's an F4. An F4 is affectionately called a double ugly. It's a reconnaissance version. There's a camera, a series of cameras in here, but that was a test vehicle. This is one of his chase flights. Some of you have seen this. This is a modified, highly modified Boeing 747 with the Enterprise Space Shuttle, a 730,000-pound aerodynamic vehicle, not a trivial aerodynamic union, sitting on top of this thing with explosive bolts here and here to separate or be taken all the way to destination, wherever that shuttle lands on Earth. It's signed by the pilots in the 747, and it's signed by the pilots in this airplane, because a postscript to this was also the first time the shuttle was released while airborne from the B-747 on an unpowered dead stick landing. It's got the gliding characteristics, just like the 104. It glides like a manhole cover or a piano. So it's one circle and put it on the ground, unpowered. Then he goes and joins the A-10 Combined Test Force. This is wall-to-wall 500-pound snake eye bombs. That's John flying this airplane. Just to give you an idea of some of the 22 major A-10 test projects, basically taking the airplane, that's John again, taking the test airplane out to the edges of the envelope to make sure that everything works, everything comes off the airplane. Had a particularly interesting troubleshooting test, where a series of tests with a 30-millimeter gun, which is probably approaching the size of a Volkswagen in here. Gun gas from the gun went into the intakes and either flamed it out or caused compressor stalls, which is not good, especially when you've got 700 A-10s in the United States Air Force fleet. He worked on certifying the aircraft for air-to-air refueling, certified engine icing performance, basically behind a fuel tanker, air-to-air refueler, but filled with water in ice to see if the engines are going to flame out. And a whole bunch of industrial trials, inertial nav, heads-up display, fire control systems. And at the same time, he's still qualified on the A7 and the T-38, and he's still doing a lot of chase and quality evaluations, flying airplanes from the small twin-engine small trainer to a B-52G 8-engine airplane. And another postscript, John was scheduled to fly this airplane on a particular day, but for some reason did not. The test pilot who did experienced a double compressor stall shooting the gun, couldn't relight the engines, ejected, and when he hit the ground, he suffered a broken neck. So it's risk management in this business, as you can deduce by now. Now there's JB at Aerospace Engineering Test Establishment in Paris of the North, Cold Lake, Alberta, head of all the Canadian Armed Forces fleet test work and senior F-18 Hornet test pilot. And you can see John, JB here, happier than a clam. That's the scar from his oxygen mask suspension. Excuse me. Just to give you a couple of examples, the CF-104 experimental test projects. The CRV-7 was a Mach 4. It's actually used by a number of air forces, designed by Bristol Aerospace. He's shooting 76 of them here. They're spin stabilized, deadly accurate. I've actually hit the middle of the simulated SAM site from 22,000 feet. Really accurate. The LW-33, a brand new inertial nav system on AT's instrumented weapons range. On the Hornet piece, wing flutter excitation. You got weapons on your wingtips, you've got weapons on your wings, and you want to excite the wings to make sure that you don't get a harmonic vibration that'll tear the wings off. And that goes to the envelope, and then he decides with a lot of very complicated algorithms how far you can take the airplane with these weapons on them, how far you can take them and release them. Navigation and weapon systems accuracy, air-to-ground radar, and air-to-air refueling. And here are two. Now, we had 138 CF-18s. Most of them were single seat. Some of them, probably 18 or 20 of them, were what we call family models, two-seaters. We'd rather have the fuel, quite frankly. And they would deploy the probe and stick it into what looks like a huge badminton basket, push the hose in and take on several thousand pounds of fuel in just a couple of minutes, just to make sure that these airplanes worked on our Boeing tankers. And they did. Then he went to NRC, and here's where it gets kind of interesting. Not so much flying fighters, or not at all flying fighters, but some really interesting stuff, including a helicopter. And in John's mind, I think, and most pilots' minds, helicopters don't really fly. The Earth rejects them. All right, this is a heavily instrumented Convair CVA 580. It's got a lot of scientists in the back, and they're chasing storms. They would go for severe icing and freezing drizzle, he'd call frizzle, to better understand the interaction of a whole bunch of atmospherics. And this is way before climate change. Canadian Atlantic Storms Project over the North Atlantic, flying out of Newfoundland, and the Beaufort Sea and Arctic Storms Experience, flying in horrible weather. The boreal ecosystem atmospherics, interaction between the boreal forest, our forests, and the atmosphere. Some international business here. There's just a few. The first international satellite cloud climatology field experiment associated with the World Climate Research Program, NRC, NASA, testing, radiation and aerosol, and of course the California cow fart project, which is basically flying over farms in California, just trying to see how much methane gas really is savored, shall we say. And here's his logbook, December 22nd, January the 6th to about the 15th or so, 1997-98, which is the ice storm of the century. And he's got in here the Canadian freezing drizzle experiment, and he's involved in this thing. There are 100 millimeters of ice pellets, freezing rain. You recall the wind blew down the high tension wires. One of my guys brought in the size of 2 footballs, ice in a freezer box. And that was how much ice was on the high tension cables as the crosswind blew all the cables and the towers down. The power grid was out, lasted some 30 days in Eastern Ontario, Quebec, Eastern Townships, and the Northern United States. And yet I could phone up the Pentagon and say, if you got any, can you supply us with, we need 20,000 cots for gyms and schools in the Eastern Townships. And they said, when do you want them? And I said, well, like tomorrow. And they called back 15 minutes later, said, really sorry, we can't do it tomorrow, but how about the day after? 2 C-17s showed up with 20,000 cots. That's the kind of relationship we actually still have with the United States military. No fatalities. And meanwhile, JB wants to fly in this, and so do all his eager scientists to collect data points. And they were saying that the dangerous part, the most dangerous part, was driving into the airport. Next is the Falcon 20. A number of really innovative research projects. NASA, Canadian Space Agency, National Research Council Astronaut Support Project with microgravity. The Americans, you've seen on television a number of airliners with people floating around in the back, where the airliner goes full speed, goes into a 45-degree positive climb, pushes 0G as the airspeed bleeds off, goes over the top and gets about 35 seconds to 45 seconds max 0G. He did the same thing with this at a much reduced cost, I should say, with those astronauts whose names are all familiar to you. And John confided in me that there was heavy use with barf bags. I can tell you, it's not a place where people are normally find themselves. Curved airport approaches, rather than doing a square rectangle and getting to the airfield, holding high in racetracks. It's basically a curved approach that he developed with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority of the United States, and differential GPS, which is very interesting. You know, you can get what, 3 feet accuracy from your normal GPS, same thing on an airplane. But if you take a GPS transmitter receiver on top of a hangar in North Bay and then transmit the data that shows the distance between the airplane on the runway and the hangar top, you get measurements in inches. And John Aitken, his first officer on these flights, would say, okay, John, you're John Croll, you're 11 inches above the runway, 10 inches, 9 inches, et cetera, 1 inch, touchdown. That's how accurate that was. And that was used for other test programs as well, that really serious accuracy was needed. John figured that out. Augmentation system is kind of this is interesting, polar margin aeromagnetic project. The magnetic pole, as most of you probably know, is migrating. It's migrating to the extent that runways have already changed. You've seen big runway numbers on the end of a runway 32. That's basically plus or minus about 5 to 6 degrees magnetic. But if the magnetic heading, because of the North Pole shifts, that runway has to be repainted to show 3-0 instead of 3-1. And that happens all over the world. They picked up ore deposits, and they were also looking for the Franklin ship. Rather interesting stuff. Synthetic aperture radar. And this one, which I'll dwell on for a moment, the Joint Winter Runway Friction Measurement Program. And this is John and his co-pilots, other test pilots, going down some of the worst runway conditions you can imagine. And the reason that came about was the fatal Dryden crash in March of '89, where 25 of, I can't remember how many people, 21 of 65 passengers were killed because the airplane took off. There was ice on the wing, and they only flew for 49 seconds before hitting the trees. And we all know that this is why exactly we have de-icing prior to takeoff worldwide. But also what was noted was the landings and rejected takeoffs on icy runway surfaces or otherwise contaminated runway surfaces. Up until that point, the James brake indicator, which is a pick-me-up truck, yellow of course, with a little trailer, would race down the runway. The driver would slam the truck's brakes on, and they'd get a reading, and that would be transmitted to pilots about the slipperiness of the runway. That wasn't good enough. So an MOU was signed. A comprehensive 5-year study was set up, and John led this whole thing. He flew most of 275 full anti-skid aircraft braking, never went off the runway, on 70 natural and man-made contaminated runway surfaces. His persuasive leadership, in his understated way, brought in the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN organization based in Montreal, the European Aviation and Space Agency, Authority, I should say, Safety Authority, UK, French, German aviation operators and manufacturers, and airplanes from NRC, NASA, FAA, First Air, NAVCAN, and even Japan, and some private airplanes were commercial airplanes, where I should say commercial, were involved. And the resulting Canadian runway friction index was accepted as the baseline measurement tables. There are modifications since then, but this was John's. John actually devised his own formulae for this, which had never been heretofore devised. And his buddies, his crew called it the Croll Runway Friction Index. He was presented with a TC NASA FAA award for this particular joint winter runway friction measurement system. And there it is there. It's not much, but it means a lot because of the organizations involved. And for all of the foregoing, and that's only part of what John did, all of these things, he then, from the Institute for Aerospace Research, was awarded the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute Trans-Canada McKee Trophy for outstanding achievement in the nations, but not just in Canada, in the United States and other countries across the world. So that's it in kind of a nutshell. Here are the 55 airplane types he's flown. That's incredible. He's certified. Well, he's certified, yeah, we know that. 7,375.2 hours is like flying an airplane 24/7 for 307 days. That's a lot of flying and a lot of airplanes that you have to be quick on the mark to figure out how to fly and how to test. But that's not all. In 2019, John was invited to be a fellow of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots. It's an organization, an international organization of about 2,500, of which no more than 10% are invited to become a fellow. He was inducted virtually in Los Angeles in 2019, and that's quite a feather in his cap. And of course, I have to throw this one in. John and I flew the last CF-104 sortie in Coal Lake on that date. And two things here. John's a natural pole hog, means if he gets the stick, he doesn't want to relinquish it. And not only did he let me fly in the front seat, he let me fly in the front seat the whole trip. We did a low-level high-speed nav, hit a couple of targets and came back, and he had a grip and grin guy taking a picture. But that picture means a lot to me because we flew, not a lot, but we flew enough to have fun together. So there you have it, gentlemen. John Bruce Croll, 8250, RMC, Lieutenant Colonel, fighter pilot, experimental test pilot, husband, father, grandfather, and one hell of a performer and one hell of a great guy. John, a tribute to you. Now, I'm going to raise a glass. You can't see this, but I have a bottle, or pardon me, not a bottle, a fighter pilot Scotch, John, that had been seen in the back bar in Baden and in the back bar in Coal Lake. So I'm taking a sip right this very minute. That's it, gentlemen.